Jozsef Revai. The activities of the Central Committee of the Hungarian Communist Party. Informative report delivered at the Conference of Representatives of several Communist parties held at the end of September 1947 in Poland. From For a Lasting Peace, for a People's Democracy, Number 3, Monday, December 15, 1947. 1. The political situation in Hungary. I shall begin my report on the situation in Hungary with a review of the parliamentary election results, for they disclose the cardinal political problems and show the relation of forces in the country. Hungarian reaction, supported by American imperialism, was in general opposed to new elections. Its plan was to utilize the parliamentary majority of the Smallholders Party after the ratification of the peace treaty and after the Allied Control Commission had finished their work to form a new government of the right without communists, and to hold elections with the help of this government in an anti-communist and anti-Soviet atmosphere. The reactionaries thus hoped to secure a majority in parliament, radically change home and foreign policy, and get the country to support American imperialism. The very fact that we were able to hold elections defeated the plans of reaction. Even at the time of the election campaign, the Americans tried to get the Smallholders Party as well as the Social Democrats to boycott the elections. Our plan was to carry out the elections and thus strengthen the party, to win a majority of left democratic parties, and thus secure the predominance of the left parties in parliament and in the government. We concluded an election agreement of the four government parties, for our proposal to form a four-party bloc with a common list of candidates was rejected by the Social Democrats and smallholders. The election agreement pledged these parties to abstain from attacking one another and to carry on a joint struggle against the reactionary parties. However, it was more of a formal agreement, since the democratic parties were conducting an election struggle also among themselves. That is why the Hungarian National Front of Independence, formed in March 1944 during the German occupation, when both the Social Democrats and smallholders were underground parties, formerly a militant alliance of the democratic forces based on the popular movement, became a parliamentary coalition. Here it should be noted that at the time of its establishment, already the Hungarian National Front of Independence was sooner an alliance of the leaders of the democratic parties rather than an organization which reflected popular resistance to the Germans and their Hungarian agents. In 1944-45, national committees were established on the territories liberated by the Soviet Army. These committees, however, were based on the parity principle, were weak, and the provisional government, formed in Debrecen in December 1944, could not rely on them. The reactionaries infiltrated into the Front of National Independence and succeeded in using the party of the smallholders to further their own ends. The front thus simply became a coalition in which an incessant struggle was carried on. What are the positive results of the parliamentary elections? We became the leading party after 25 years of illegality, when our party actually constituted only a small group. After the country's liberation by the Soviet Army, we became the first party in the country as a result of constructive work and a resolute struggle against the enemies of the people. In 1945, the Communist Party received 800,000 votes, that is, 17% of the total vote. In 1947, 1,118,000 votes, that is, 22.3% of the total vote. The social composition of the votes polled by the party is as follows: peasants, 500,000, workers, 450,000, intelligentsia and petty bourgeoisie, 160,000. The following figures are also most interesting. The Communist Party's candidates polled 70 to 80% of the minors' vote, 65% of the votes in the heavy industrial centers, and 27.5% of the vote in Budapest, as against 22% in 1945. Whereas in 1945 we were in the minority in the provincial towns, today we are ahead of the Social Democrats. That same year, the Communists received 145,000 votes in the 6 biggest cities, and the Social Democrats 207,000. In 1947, the figure was 203,000 for the Communists and 186,000 for the Social Democrats. However, it would be incorrect to overestimate our increased influence among the working class. Facts and figures go to show that we have as yet not won the decisive majority among the working class. There are important industrial centers and cities where the forces of the Communists and Social Democrats are equally balanced, and in some cases the Social Democrats predominate, as for instance in the capital suburbs. A new and positive factor in Hungary is the turn of the peasantry to the left. This, of course, is not as yet a common feature. It does not as yet affect even all the poor and middle peasants. There is still considerable dissatisfaction among the peasantry. They are still greatly under the influence of the Church. However, note should be taken of the positive fact that 1,450,000 peasants, that is to say, 2/3 of the whole peasantry, cast their votes for the four-party coalition. Of the 1,450,000 peasant votes, the Communist Party received 500,000, the Social Democrats 200,000, the Peasant Party 350,000, whereas the left parties together polled 1,050,000 votes. This fact is particularly important when one bears in mind that the Hungarian reactionary bourgeoisie is trying to set the peasants against the workers, and with the help of the former to isolate the working class headed by the Communists. This plan of the bourgeoisie has not been completely frustrated. The fight for the peasantry continues, and we have scored certain successes in this field, as evidenced by the election results. The National Peasant Party grew stronger in the course of the elections and received 420,000 votes, that is, 90,000 more votes than in 1945. It should not be forgotten that this party is the party of the poor peasant. Thus, the coalition as a whole received 60.8% of the vote, or 65% of the mandates, and the three left parties, which polled 46% of the vote, received 50% of the mandates. I shall now pass over to the factors which show that we have nonetheless not fully succeeded in achieving our aim, namely that of creating a firm majority of the left in Parliament, and thus ensuring the development of Hungary along the path of people's democracy. The situation inside the government coalition is complicated by the fact that the Social Democrats and smallholders have sustained heavy losses. The Social Democrats lost some 80,000 votes in the elections, and the smallholders nearly 2 million votes. In view of this, the right-wing groups in these parties staged a revolt and tried to seize the leadership. As for the Social Democrats, their policy in the election campaign was dictated by the right wing. They wanted to become the successors in the smallholders' party, and hence took the line of winning the votes of the reactionary elements. To achieve this, they propagated the anti-communist and occasionally anti-Soviet slogans and arguments of reaction. Thus, for instance, the provocative rumor was circulated throughout the country that if the communists emerged victorious in the elections, collective farms would immediately be instituted. By conducting anti-communist and anti-Soviet agitation, they did a service to the right-wing parties and a disservice to themselves. The Social Democrats failed in their plan to become the strongest party in the country. Firstly, because the leader of the right wing, Karli Peyer, withdrew from the Social Democratic Party and ran on the ticket of one of the bourgeois parties. This, of course, gave rise to confusion among the Social Democrats. Secondly, because the Social Democrats and bourgeois parties fought for the vote of the petty bourgeoisie, with the result that the Social Democrats lost heavily in this struggle. The Social Democrats not only failed to gain a foothold among the peasantry, they also lost their influence in the central agrarian areas, lost many votes in the very places where the peasantry as a whole are democratically inclined. As for the smallholders, they suffered a complete fiasco. As earlier stated, this party lost some 2 million votes. It was the bulwark of Hungarian reaction. American and British imperialism, particularly, placed high hopes on this party, all the more so since it held 57% of the vote, was known for its democratic traditions in the past, relied for much of its support not only on the kulak but also on the middle peasant, was in the opposition to the government at the time of the Horthy regime. All forces of reaction, including the landlords and bourgeoisie, unanimously supported this party at the 1945 elections. We succeeded as a result of a 2-year struggle in offsetting to a considerable extent the influence of the reactionaries on the democratic core and peasant mass of the party. You know of Reaction's plot, which was headed by the leaders of this party. Reaction, which took cover in this party, was dealt a crushing blow when we exposed Ferenc Nagy, former premier of the government and leader of the smallholders' party, as one of the ringleaders in the plot. This took place while he was vacationing in Switzerland. Although advised by the Americans not to resign and return to Hungary to further the plot, Ferenc Nagy lacked the courage to face trial. What is the situation today in this party? After the smallholders' party compromised itself in the conspiracy, and left-wing elements took over leadership, a large number of the reactionary forces withdrew from the party. The struggle for leadership between the democratic and reactionary forces inside the party, started at the time of the elections, continues. As a result of the disintegration in this party, the reactionary elements in its ranks and outside the party realized that it could no longer be used as the principal tool in the struggle against Hungarian democracy. This is why they formed new reactionary parties. I have in mind 2 parties mainly. They are, 1. The so-called Democratic People's Party, headed by Barankovic. This party actually represents in the main the Catholic clergy. Footnote: apart from enemies of Hungarian democracy, this party also has elements who are opposed to following the path of reaction. It is therefore possible to make certain differentiations in its ranks. End of footnote. In the elections, it received 800,000 votes. Politically, it relies on the most backward sections of the peasantry and above all on the women. 2. The pro-fascist Pfeiffer Party, the so-called Hungarian Independence Party, which is the principal enemy of Hungarian democracy. In the last parliamentary elections, this party polled more than 600,000 votes, mostly in the cities. It is the open agent of American imperialism, which is using this party mainly to interfere in the internal affairs of Hungary. It must be acknowledged that we underestimated the strength of these 2 reactionary parties. It was therefore only in the last stage of the election struggle that we opened fire on them. Before passing over to my report on the present situation in Hungary, allow me to summarize the aforesaid briefly. 1. The democratic forces, and above all our party, have grown stronger. That is to say, Hungarian democracy has a more solid foundation today. 2. The differentiation of forces in the country continues. This, in its turn, means that the struggle between the democratic and reactionary forces of Hungary is growing sharper. We know just how strong we are, that we are consolidating our positions. However, we are not blind to the enemy, and under no circumstances mean to underestimate his strength. 3. Parallel with the general alignment of forces, a differentiation is taking place in the camp of democracy itself, where right-wing groups are being formed which intend to collaborate up to a point with the anti-communist forces. On the other hand, the left-wing elements in the democratic parties are gradually moving over to us in order to combat reaction jointly. Bearing all this in mind, as well as the acute international situation, it can be said that Hungarian democracy is advancing toward major political battles. 2. The struggle around the formation of the new government. The sharpening of contradictions, earlier mentioned by me, became evident during the negotiations to form a new government. 1. The right-wing group in the smallholders' party tried to capture the party leadership with the object of having their representatives in the new government, who would actually have been the trusted agents of the pro-fascists. Moreover, these same groups made stipulations which, once accepted, would have signified the adoption of a virtually reactionary program by the new government. The right-wing Social Democrats held the left wing responsible for their defeat in the elections. In order to seize the party leadership, they held mass demonstrations against the left-wing leaders. Under this pressure, the Social Democratic leadership adopted a decision that Social Democrats would participate in the government only under certain conditions, that is, only if they were given a number of key positions in the state apparatus. This would have threatened our party with isolation, would have retarded the formation of the new government. Even more, it would have jeopardized the very possibility of its formation, or made it possible only by major concessions on the part of the democratic forces. How did we avert this danger? By mobilizing the masses to combat the danger of reaction, and by publishing our government program. 300,000 persons attended the mass meeting on the Square of Heroes in Budapest. Our slogans were, immediately form a new, strong democratic government, put a stop to the political intrigues started in connection with the formation of the government and set to work, down with the enemies of democracy. Our government program contained the demand for a 3-year economic plan. We proposed a series of measures to cover the deficit in the government budget, to combat high prices, corruption, and to provide the working people with provisions. We organized a popular movement around these slogans and our government program. At the same time, the plenum of the Central Committee of the party resolutely declared that the Communist Party does not intend to extend the government coalition to the right, that it does not intend to include right-wing elements of the democratic parties in the coalition. We succeeded in this way in reaching agreement on the formation of the new government. Of the 15 members in the new government, 5 are communists, 4 social democrats, 4 smallholders, 2 members of the Peasant Party. The composition of the present government precludes the possibility of decisions being taken detrimental to the left democratic forces. It is clear that the attempts of the right-wing elements to establish a united front against the communists have suffered only a temporary setback, and that these attempts will be renewed. 3. The line of the party in the new conditions and its prospects. We have won one of the battles with the formation of the new government, but we are aware that the cardinal question of Hungarian democracy, that is, whether this democracy will, ultimately, be a popular democracy or a bourgeois democracy, has not yet been settled. In connection with this, also the second major question, whether Hungary will join the ranks of the neighboring people's democracies, or whether she will, in one form or another, become the bulwark of Anglo-American imperialism, has not been settled. In order to understand the internal political struggle in Hungary, account must be taken of the policy of American imperialism, which is aimed at turning Hungary into a base of struggle against the USSR and the countries of people's democracy. Hungarian democracy contains the elements of popular and bourgeois democracy. What are the economic elements of the people's democracy to date? 1. Feudal relations have been eradicated in the country, and a radical agrarian reform introduced. 650,000 poor peasants and landless laborers have received allotments at the expense of manorial and church estates. The democratic government is helping them in every way to develop their farms. 2. Heavy industry, iron and steel, mining, electric power has been nationalized. Also the bauxite and aluminum industries will be nationalized in the near future. The 3 big banks, which control about 60% of Hungary's industry, will be nationalized. Footnote: the Hungarian parliament has already adopted laws nationalizing heavy industry and the banks. End of footnote. 4. State control of the country's economic and financial life through the Supreme Economic Council, where left democratic elements predominate. 5. The introduction of a 3-year plan to restore the national economy. This plan is promoting the development of the state sector and curbing the activities of the capitalists. What are the political elements of the people's democracy? 1. The decisive role of the working class in the country's political life has been secured by the United Front, even though cooperation between the 2 workers' parties is passing through a crisis now. 2. The alliance of the working class with a considerable section of the toiling peasantry This has been achieved primarily through the close alliance of the Communist Party with the National Peasant Party and with the Democrats in the Smallholders Party. 3. The Communist Party is the biggest party of the workers and peasants in the country. 4. The decisive influence of the workers' parties in the armed forces and the police. What are the elements of bourgeois democracy? 1. A considerable part of industry and practically the whole of commerce are still in the hands of the capitalists. 2. The kulak farms, which obstruct grain deliveries, are supplying the black market. 3. The administrative apparatus is made up, for the most part, of old officials. 4. The influence of reactionary clericalism, which constitutes a serious force, is far from having been eliminated. 5. The existence of reactionary parties and of a pro-fascist party in parliament. 6. The existence of right-wing anti-communist groups in the democratic parties. Since the country's liberation by the Soviet army, the conflict between the two elements in Hungarian democracy has sharpened. The course of this conflict shows that the elements of the people's democracy are growing and already outbalance the elements of bourgeois democracy. What are the facts that prove this? The introduction of the agrarian reform in 1945, the stabilization of the currency system in 1946, the denouncement and liquidation of the plot against the Republic, the adoption of the 3-year economic plan in 1947, and the formation of a democratic government after the elections in August of this year. The conflict between the two trends continues and is growing sharper. Hungary has scored major successes in the field of economic restoration. Our industry has reached 80% of the pre-war level. Transport, destroyed by the war, has been restored, thanks to the effective measures taken by Comrade Gera, the Minister of Communications. The country's coal mines are producing 85% of the pre-war output. The stabilization of the monetary system in August 1946 enabled Hungarian economy to develop rapidly and raise the standard of living of the working people. Thus, for instance, on August 1, 1946, workers' earnings did not exceed 40% of the pre-war figure. In the succeeding year, however, real wages averaged 60% of the pre-war level. Stabilization of the economic base strengthened democracy's political foundation. However, it also strengthened the position of the capitalist, especially in commerce. Here it should be mentioned that the country's economic and financial difficulties have resulted in additional hardships. For 3 successive years, Hungary suffered a drought. This means that this year the grain crop was only 30% of the estimated harvest. That is, 5 million centners less than we expected. Because of this, the government has been compelled to cut the bread ration. The national income this year will be $150 million American dollars less. That is, a cut of 10% of the total income. It follows from this that the stabilization measures introduced last August have not as yet taken firm root, and that we have to continue the struggle to accomplish this. The Central Committee of the party has outlined a series of measures to cope with the difficulties in the spheres of economy, finance, and supply. The most important of these are 1. Increased productivity of labor in industry. Industrial output averages approximately 80% of the pre-war level, and in certain branches, as for instance in the textile, 100%. However, the productivity of labor is very low, which explains why the net cost of production is comparatively high, resulting in a deficit in nationalized industry. 2. To eliminate the deficit by introducing rationalization measures, especially in the state enterprises, by tightening labor discipline, etc. 3. To combat high prices by means of economic and administrative measures. 4. A substantial tax increase on the incomes and property of capitalists. 5. A strict economy regime in the state apparatus. To accomplish this, we have even decided to cut capital investments, provided for in the 3-year plan by 25% in the initial stages of the plan, in order later, when the economic situation is more favorable, to speed the realization of the plan. The paramount task of our party in its economic and financial policy is to support the stabilization measures, to counteract the inflation tendencies, and at the same time, more vigorously to curb the capitalists. Our experience has shown that inflation saps the foundations of democracy, economically and politically. We cannot cope with our political tasks unless we preserve democracy's firm economic base. Experience has also proved that it is not easy to advance and secure the victory of the people's democracy in Hungary so long as right-wing elements exist in the democratic parties. The four-party coalition, which, at the close of 1944, formed a provisional national government on the basis of the National Front of Independence, has actually dwindled down to parliamentary and government cooperation. The right-wing elements consider the policy of cooperation with the communists a temporary evil, and at the first opportune moment will try to oppose the communists and break off contact with them. Our party must strengthen the alliance with the democratic forces, which can solve the cardinal question of developing the people's democracy in Hungary. How can the people's democracy be further developed? The following is imperative. 1. To help the left elements in the social democratic parties successfully counteract the aggressive policy of the right-wing social democrats, to strengthen the united front, and thus bring closer the prospect of establishing a united party of the Hungarian working class. 2. To help the democratic elements in the smallholders' party, which rely on the peasant masses in this party, to strengthen their cooperation with the workers' parties. 3. To strengthen the alliance with the National Peasants' Party in every conceivable manner. 4. To further extend the mass base of the Communist Party. 5. We consider the disbandment of Pfeiffer's pro-fascist party, which serves as a legal cover for Hungarian fascism, an important step towards consolidating the people's democracy. Footnote: the Hungarian government has disbanded Pfeiffer's pro-fascist party, and Parliament has annulled this party's deputy mandates. End of footnote. 4. Party activities. The party has won great authority in the past 2.5 years since the liberation of Hungary by the Soviet Army. Even our enemies admit that the Communist Party is the driving force in the country's state life. Before the elections, the Institute of Public Opinion asked the question, who is the most popular government figure in the country? Comrade Rákosi received the majority of votes. He enjoys the greatest authority and popularity of the leaders of Hungarian democracy. Our party today has more than 750,000 members. During the election campaign in August 1947, 100,000 new members joined the Communist Party. The social composition of the party is as follows: workers, 420,000, peasants, 280,000, intellectuals, artisans, small traders, etc., 50,000. 25 to 30% of the membership are women. We have 4,700 primary organizations at factories, in the countrysides and in the cities. Of the 3,200 villages, only 60 have no party organization. Some 10,000 of the 750,000 members were in the party at the time of its illegality. Nearly 50,000 were former members of the legal Social Democratic Party or the trade unions persecuted by the Horthy regime. After the liberation of Hungary, the party found itself in conditions similar to those existing in the other countries earlier mentioned by the comrades from the fraternal parties. The increase in the party's membership meant that it had been joined by people lacking practical experience and ideological training. With regard to cadres, our party has the same shortcomings as the other fraternal parties. However, I do not intend to start with the shortcomings. I shall speak about the successes and strength of the young party members. The party would not have been able to successfully solve the tasks of the last 2.5 years with the help of the old cadres alone. Thanks to the assistance of the young cadres, we were able at the beginning of 1945 to divide up the landed estates virtually in the space of a few weeks. The Budapest party organization dispatched hundreds and thousands of workers to the villages to assist the peasant committees in this work, with the result that the peasants received 3.5 million morgens of land. Furthermore, the alliance between workers and peasants was formed and consolidated. With the help of the young cadres, the party was able to advance and put into effect the slogan to restore transport. Thanks to the fact that 10,000 railway cars and 500 locomotives were repaired by December 31st, 1945, our cities were not caught in the vice of hunger in the winter of 1945-46. By relying on the assistance of the young cadres, the party was able to spearhead the popular movement for the economic rehabilitation of the country, which started immediately after the liberation of Hungary. The young communists inspired the workers in the difficult period of inflation, when it was impossible to purchase anything on their earnings, and the workers went hungry. Together with other party members, they tightened discipline in labor, with the result that the country's industrial output increased from month to month, and in August 1946, at the time of stabilization, reached 60 to 70% of the pre-war level. With the help of these young cadres, we were able, in the 2 years, to mobilize the popular masses against reaction and emerge victorious in the struggle. We do not mean to conceal the shortcomings of our young cadres, shortcomings which are sometimes reflected in a certain lack of understanding of the democratic and national policy of our party. The broad masses looked upon the party as the party of 1919, as the party of the dictatorship of the proletariat. There were many old communists who thought that the Soviet army had liberated Hungary in order to establish Soviet power, in order to continue what had been started in 1919. These people did not understand the policy of cooperation with the other democratic parties. They acted like small dictators in the villages and regions where they caused considerable harm to the party. Left sectarianism, particularly in relation to the Social Democrats, still exists, even though we have removed many comrades with left-wing tendencies from responsible positions. Our organizations have started everyday explanatory work among the working people to display interest in municipal questions and to visit villages on Sundays. Thanks to this change, we were successful in the last election campaign. We are striving to overcome the theoretical and political weaknesses of our cadres. Our party education is organized as follows. In every area we have 3-week courses. There are 2 3-month party schools and 1 6-month central party school. Apart from this, we have organized hundreds of lectures and special courses for officers, students, municipal workers, etc. In preparation for the elections, our special courses trained thousands of agitators. Our theoretical organ, which has a circulation of 15,000 copies, plays its part in the education of our party cadres. The Communist daily press has a big circulation in the country. The party's central organ, with a daily circulation of 110,000 copies, and Sunday issue 160,000 copies, is the biggest paper in Hungary. In addition, there are 3 popular papers in the country, with a total circulation of 180,000 copies. We publish 15 dailies and 45 papers which appear 1, 2, or 3 times weekly. The party publishing house has issued a considerable amount of political literature and fiction. Our influence on the cinema and radio is extensive. The party's influence also among the intelligentsia is widespread. Nearly 20% of the country's physicians and engineers are communists. Many prominent writers, actors, scientists, and artists are members of the party. There are a number of mass organizations in Hungary, of which the trade unions are the most important. Their membership is close to 1.5 million. The influence of the communists in the leading trade unions is increasing. The mass organization of women, the Democratic Union of Hungarian Women, and of the youth, the Democratic Union of Hungarian Youth, are not as yet playing their appropriate role. The Union of New Landholders, the organization of the peasants who received land in keeping with the agrarian reform, is the most important mass organization in the countryside. Formed on our initiative, its leadership consists of peasants belonging to different parties. The party also enjoys influence among the democratic organizations of handicraftsmen and small merchants. Regarding the future tasks of our party, it should be pointed out that it must still further strengthen its contact with the masses, raise the ideological level of its members, remove careerists and alien elements from office, and promote to leading positions communists who have the confidence of the people and are popular among them. 5. Foreign policy. The questions of home and foreign policy of Hungarian democracy are closely interlinked. The reactionary section of Hungarian society, the big capitalists, former landlords, kulaks, and the Horthy bureaucracy are enemies of the people's democracy and the proponents of Anglo-American orientation in the country. The weakening and eradication of native reaction narrows down Anglo-American imperialism's base in the country and guarantees the democratic orientation of Hungary's foreign policy. Hungary's former ruling classes were the vassals of German fascism and fought on its side up to the very last. Thanks to their policy, Hungary remained Hitler's vassal. They led the country to catastrophe. The Hungarian big capitalists and landlords were linked with Germany. In German fascism, they saw their champion against the Hungarian workers and peasants. The desire to dominate the Slav peoples and the Romanians of Transylvania turned Hungary's ruling classes into a vassal of German fascism. Chauvinism and territorial revisionism always served as the tools in the greater Hungarian policy to distract the attention of the Hungarian working people from the exploitation inside the country, from the national treachery of the ruling classes, and for instigation of the Hungarian working masses against the neighboring nations. The struggle against the German menace to the independence of Hungary has always been closely linked with the struggle for Hungarian democracy and for an alliance with the Slav peoples. The history of the Hungarian movement for independence knows of innumerable attempts to establish contacts with the neighboring Slav peoples. Already during the war, the Hungarian communists declared that the struggle against the German invaders is linked with the struggle for independence in alliance with the neighboring Slav nations fighting for their freedom, that it is linked with the struggle to reject the chauvinism of a greater Hungary. We defended this viewpoint also after the country's liberation, at the time of the preparations for the Paris Peace Conference, when chauvinism was again rearing its head in the country. While opposing these chauvinistic tendencies, we at the same time supported certain moderate national demands at the peace conference, since this corresponded to the just national sentiments of the Hungarian people. After the peace treaty was signed, however, the Communist Party resolutely declared that it was necessary to put an end to territorial revisionism, that Hungarian democracy cannot tolerate any measures aimed against its democratic neighbors. We are guided by the teachings of Lenin and Stalin that the national question must be subordinated to the general question of democratic progress. The greater Hungarian chauvinism is still evident in Hungary. Today it is being fostered by Anglo-American imperialism instead of by the Hitlerites. However, Hungarian chauvinism is losing influence among the popular masses. The working class is grateful to the USSR for its liberation. 650,000 Hungarian peasants will always remember that they received land thanks to the Soviet army. When land allotments were being made, the following inscription was a common sight in the countryside: "We thank Stalin for the land." The sympathy of the Hungarian people for the new Yugoslavia is explained by the fact that they know that the federative Yugoslavia has given the Hungarians inside that country freedom and the opportunity to develop their own national culture. For the same reason, Hungarian reaction finds it very difficult to incite anti-Romanian sentiments, for the Hungarians in Transylvania have received national rights. The policy of American imperialism, which applies the methods of German imperialism, the lifelong enemy of Hungarian independence, makes it easier for us to combine the defense of Hungary's independence with the struggle against American imperialism and for an alliance with the neighboring democratic nations, above all with the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. The Hungarian people are interested in joining the union of the democratic peoples fighting for freedom and independence. The democratic parties, for their part, are interested in helping Hungary achieve this so as to prevent her being used as a wedge of Anglo-American imperialism in the valley of the Danube. We, Hungarian communists, as the party of the people, represent the interests of the people. We cannot accept the fact that Hungarians in Slovakia have been deprived of civil liberties. We hope that ultimately an agreement will be reached on this question. Hungarian democracy has also displayed its strength on questions of foreign policy. The Communist Party successfully opposed Hungarian chauvinism in connection with the peace treaty. The government unanimously decided not to participate in the Paris Conference on the question of the so-called Marshall Plan. Despite Anglo-Saxon intrigues, Hungary has concluded a Hungarian-Yugoslav Treaty of Mutual Economic Assistance, which was welcomed by the people. Our government program envisages the conclusion of treaties of amity and mutual aid with our democratic neighbors, and we hope to settle these questions without delay. We are educating the Hungarian people to despise the Anglo-Saxon and particularly the American imperialists, and are combining this with the struggle for Hungarian independence. We are exposing the reactionary classes as the traitors of the people and as the servitors of foreign imperialism. Hungarian democracy needs the assistance of the neighboring democracies to carry out its home and foreign tasks. This assistance can be either economic, as for instance the trade agreement with the Soviet Union or the economic agreement with Yugoslavia, or in the form of moral political help. But we do not only seek assistance. The Hungarian communists realize their responsibilities. They also realize that they can render invaluable assistance to our comrades in the neighboring countries by eradicating native reaction and building up a state in Hungary which the neighboring nations need not fear and which they could rely upon as an ally. To cope with this task, we need the advice, consultation, and exchange of experience of our fraternal parties. The Hungarian Communist Party, therefore, greets this conference all the more since the international situation, in our opinion, is becoming more complicated with every passing day, and the coordination of policy of the Communist parties is imperative. There are a number of international questions which can be solved only by collective effort. I greet the conference on behalf of the Central Committee of our party.